Just knit and stay out of grown-up conversations. My niece Ashton spat those words at me across my sister's dinner table, and every head turned to watch the crazy old aunt get put in her place. But 2 weeks later, when I walked into her company's board meeting and the CEO stood up to announce that I was their new majority shareholder, I watched Ashton's face drain of every drop of color, and I realized that sometimes the sweetest revenge is served with a corner office. Before I tell you how a 68-year-old woman they dismissed as a knitting grandmother came to own 52% of a tech company worth $80 million, take a moment to subscribe and comment below where you're watching from. This story might just change how you see age, power, and the dangerous mistake of underestimating someone based on their gray hair. My name is Margaret Maggie Hollister. I'm 68 years old, and for the past decade, my family has treated me like a relic, something to be tolerated at holidays, smiled at politely, and otherwise forgotten. But they made one critical error: they never asked where my money came from. Let me start from the beginning. I was born in 1957 in a small town outside of Cleveland, Ohio. My father worked at a steel mill. My mother was a seamstress. We weren't poor, but we weren't comfortable either. Every penny was counted, every meal was planned, and luxuries were things that happened to other people. I was the middle child of 3 sisters. My older sister Patricia was the beauty, blonde, delicate, destined for a good marriage. My younger sister Janet was the baby, spoiled, coddled, everyone's favorite. And I was Maggie, plain, practical, forgettable. I learned early that no one was going to hand me anything. So I studied. I worked. I babysat and tutored and saved every dollar I earned. When I graduated high school in 1975, I had enough money for 1 year of community college and a dream that everyone said was foolish: I wanted to work on Wall Street. In 1975, women didn't work on Wall Street. They were secretaries. They fetched coffee. They smiled and nodded and stayed out of the way. But I didn't care about what women didn't do. I cared about what I was going to do. I moved to New York City with $200, a suitcase, and the kind of stubborn determination that only comes from having nothing to lose. I got a job as a receptionist at a small investment firm. I worked 12-hour days. I listened to everything the traders said. I read every financial report I could get my hands on. And slowly, painfully, I learned. By 1980, I had talked my way into a junior analyst position. By 1985, I was managing my own small portfolio of clients. By 1990, I had been promoted to senior fund manager at one of the top firms in the city. I was making more money than my father had earned in his entire lifetime, and I was just getting started. But here's the thing about being a woman in finance in the 1980s and 1990s: the harassment was constant, the discrimination was institutional, and the loneliness was crushing. I never married. I never had children. I was too focused on surviving in a world that told me every single day that I didn't belong. My family didn't understand. Patricia had married a successful dentist and spent her days playing tennis and chairing charity committees. Janet had married a real estate developer and popped out 3 perfect children. They invited me to holidays out of obligation, but they never asked about my work. They never asked about my life. Maggie works in New York, they'd tell people vaguely. Something with numbers. Something with numbers. That's how they described a 30-year career that made me one of the most successful female fund managers of my generation. In 2010, I retired with a personal net worth of approximately $120 million. I didn't tell my family. Why would I? They'd never been interested before. They'd spent decades making me feel like the odd one out, the strange sister who chose a career over a family, who lived alone in a Manhattan apartment instead of a nice suburban house with a husband and children. When I retired, I moved to a quiet town in Vermont. I bought a modest farmhouse. I started gardening. I took up knitting, genuinely, I love knitting. I joined a book club. I adopted 3 cats. And I began investing again, quietly, through a series of holding companies and LLCs that kept my name out of the spotlight. I wasn't managing other people's money anymore. I was managing my own. And I was very, very good at it. Over the next decade, my wealth grew. I invested in real estate, in startups, in established companies looking for private equity. I had a particular interest in technology, specifically, in companies that were innovative but undervalued. I'd learned to spot potential when others saw risk. One of those companies was called NextGen Solutions. NextGen was a tech startup based in Austin, Texas, specializing in healthcare software. They developed a platform that helped hospitals manage patient data more efficiently, reducing errors, cutting costs, saving lives. It was exactly the kind of company I loved: meaningful work, strong fundamentals, room to grow. I made my first investment in NextGen in 2018, a quiet injection of capital through one of my holding companies. Over the next few years, I continued to buy shares. By 2023, I owned 47% of the company. And I had no idea that my niece Ashton worked there. Ashton is Patricia's daughter, my eldest sister's youngest child. She's 34 years old, has an MBA from a prestigious business school, and carries herself with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no. I hadn't seen her much over the years. She'd been a teenager when I retired, and our paths rarely crossed. I knew she worked in tech somewhere, but Patricia's descriptions of her daughter's career were always vague, probably because Patricia didn't understand what Ashton actually did. I certainly didn't know that Ashton had risen to become the chief operating officer of NextGen Solutions. But I found out at Thanksgiving dinner last year. The family gathered at Patricia's house in suburban Chicago, a sprawling colonial that screamed old money even though their money wasn't that old. I drove in from Vermont, as I did most years, expecting the usual, polite small talk, thinly veiled condescension, and an early escape to the guest room with a book. What I got instead was a front row seat to my own humiliation. The dinner table was crowded: Patricia and her husband Douglas, Janet and her husband Robert, their various children and grandchildren, and me. The lone spinster aunt at the end of the table, smiling pleasantly while everyone talked over her. The conversation turned to careers, as it always did. Patricia's son had just been made partner at his law firm. Janet's daughter had sold her interior design business for a healthy profit. And Ashton was practically glowing. The company is on track to be valued at over $80 million by next quarter, she announced, swirling her wine. We're in talks with several major hospital systems on the East Coast. Our growth trajectory is phenomenal. That's wonderful, dear, Patricia beamed. You've worked so hard. It's not just hard work, Ashton said with a smug smile. It's about vision. Understanding where the industry is going. Making the tough calls that others are afraid to make. I couldn't help myself. What kind of tough calls? Ashton's eyes flickered to me, the first time she'd acknowledged my existence all evening. Business decisions, Aunt Maggie. You probably wouldn't understand. Try me, I said mildly. I've read a bit about the healthcare tech sector. Read a bit? Ashton laughed. That's cute. But reading about business and actually doing it are very different things. No offense, but what would you know about running a company? You spent your whole career doing, what was it? Something with numbers? The table chuckled. Patricia smiled apologetically. Janet studied her wine glass. I felt the familiar sting of being dismissed, but I kept my composure. I managed investment portfolios, actually. For about 30 years. That's nice. Ashton's tone was the verbal equivalent of a pat on the head. But that's not the same as building something from the ground up. At NextGen, we're doing real innovation. We're changing healthcare. It takes a certain kind of mind to understand the complexities. I'm sure it does, I said quietly. But Ashton wasn't finished. You know what your problem is, Aunt Maggie? She leaned back in her chair, emboldened by wine and an audience. You've never actually accomplished anything. You lived alone in New York doing something with numbers, and now you live alone in Vermont doing, what? Knitting? She laughed. You're 68 years old. Why are you even trying to insert yourself into grown-up conversations? Just knit and stay quiet. The words hung in the air like a slap. I saw Patricia's face tighten, but she didn't say anything. Janet looked away. The children shifted uncomfortably. Douglas suddenly became very interested in his mashed potatoes. No one defended me. No one corrected her. For a moment, I felt the same old shame, the familiar ache of being invisible, worthless, forgotten. And then something shifted inside me. I set down my fork, dabbed my mouth with my napkin, and smiled the kind of smile that 30 years on Wall Street had taught me. You're right, Ashton, I said pleasantly. I probably don't understand the complexities of your business. I apologize for interrupting. Ashton smirked triumphantly and returned to her wine. I finished my meal in silence. I went to bed early. And the next morning, I drove back to Vermont. But I didn't forget. The following Monday, I called my lawyer. Richard, I said, I want you to find out everything you can about NextGen Solutions. Specifically, I want to know who their major shareholders are and what percentage is available for acquisition. Richard had been my attorney for 20 years. He didn't ask questions. He just delivered results. 3 days later, I had my answer. NextGen's ownership was distributed among several venture capital firms, a handful of angel investors, and employee stock options. The largest single shareholder held 19%. No one was even close to a controlling interest. Except me. I already owned 47% through my holding companies. If I acquired just 6% more, I would own more than half the company. I would be the majority shareholder, able to make decisions, call meetings, and if I wanted, replace leadership. I made some calls. I offered premium prices to 2 small investors who were looking to exit. Within 10 days, I owned 52% of NextGen Solutions. My niece's company. And she had no idea. The next board meeting was scheduled for December 15th, 2 weeks after Thanksgiving. I informed the board that I would be attending in person as the company's new majority shareholder. I asked that my identity be kept confidential until my arrival. The morning of the meeting, I flew to Ashton. I dressed carefully, a charcoal suit, understated jewelry, my hair pulled back in a neat silver chignon. I looked exactly like what I was, a woman who had spent decades commanding rooms full of men who underestimated her. The NextGen headquarters was a sleek glass building in a trendy part of downtown. I walked through the lobby, past the receptionist who smiled at me blankly, and took the elevator to the executive floor. The boardroom was already full when I arrived. Through the glass walls, I could see the CEO, a middle-aged man named David Chen, shuffling papers at the head of the table. The CFO sat to his right. The head of product development was reviewing something on his laptop. And there, at the far end of the table, sat Ashton. She was wearing a red power blazer, her hair blown out perfectly, her expression the same confident smirk she'd worn at Thanksgiving. She looked like a woman who believed she was untouchable. I pushed open the door. Every head turned. Ashton's eyes landed on me, and for a moment, she didn't recognize me. I was out of context. The knitting aunt from Vermont didn't belong in an Ashton boardroom. Her brow furrowed in confusion. Then David Chen stood up. "Everyone," he said, gesturing toward me, "I'd like you to meet Margaret Hollister. As of last week, she is NextGen's majority shareholder, controlling 52% of our company." The silence that followed was absolute. I watched Ashton's face go through a remarkable transformation, confusion to disbelief to shock to something approaching terror. Her red blazer suddenly looked less powerful and more desperate. That's impossible," she stammered. "Our shareholder structure. I would have known." "The shares were held through several holding companies," I said calmly, taking the empty seat at the head of the table. "Hollister Capital, MH Ventures, and Granite Peak Holdings. You may recognize those names from your quarterly reports, if you read them carefully." Ashton's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. "For those who don't know me," I continued, addressing the room, "I spent 30 years managing investment portfolios on Wall Street. I retired in 2010. Since then, I've focused on private equity investments, primarily in healthcare technology and related sectors." I smiled. "I'm very selective about the companies I invest in. I believed in NextGen's mission and its potential. That's why I've been building my position over the past 5 years." David Chen found his voice first. "Ms. Hollister, we're honored to have you here. We had no idea that our largest investor was, well, an old woman who knits." I offered lightly. He had the decency to look embarrassed. "I understand there may be some surprise," I said. "And I want to be clear, I'm not here to disrupt your operations. NextGen is a well-run company with enormous potential. I intend to be a supportive shareholder." I paused, letting my gaze travel around the table until it landed on Ashton. "However," I continued, "I do believe in accountability. And I expect everyone on this leadership team to conduct themselves with professionalism, integrity, and respect, for each other, for employees, and for stakeholders of all kinds." Ashton had gone pale. Her hands were trembling slightly against the table. "In fact," I said, "I'd like to schedule a private meeting with each member of the executive team over the next week. I want to understand your roles, your challenges, and your vision for the company's future. Starting with you, Ms. Ashton Marshall." I looked directly at her. "Perhaps we can discuss the complexities of running a business that I supposedly wouldn't understand." The meeting continued for another 2 hours. I asked intelligent questions about product roadmaps, customer acquisition costs, regulatory challenges, and long-term growth strategies. I could see the surprise on their faces. This wasn't the doddering old aunt they'd imagined. This was a woman who had been making million-dollar decisions since before most of them were born. By the time the meeting ended, I had their respect. Not because I demanded it, but because I demonstrated it. Ashton tried to slip out quickly, but I caught her in the hallway. "Ms. Marshall," I called. "A word?" She stopped, her shoulders rigid, and slowly turned to face me. Up close, I could see the fear in her eyes, the dawning realization that everything she'd built could be taken away by the woman she'd dismissed as irrelevant. "Aunt Maggie, Ms. Hollister, I don't know what to say." Her voice was shaking. "I had no idea. None of us knew. If I had known, would you have treated me differently?" I asked quietly. "Would you have shown me basic human respect if you'd known I had money and power?" She didn't answer. We both knew the truth. "Here's what's going to happen," I said. "I'm not going to fire you. I'm not going to publicly humiliate you. That's not who I am." Relief flooded her face. "Thank you. Thank you so much." "I'm not finished." My voice hardened. "You're talented, Ashton. You wouldn't have risen this far if you weren't. But talent without character is a liability. The way you treated me at Thanksgiving, the way you've clearly treated anyone you consider beneath you, that has to change." She nodded frantically. "It will. I promise." I don't want promises. I want action. Over the next 6 months, I expect you to demonstrate genuine leadership, not just competence, but integrity. Mentor younger employees. Listen to perspectives that differ from your own. Treat every person in this company with respect, from the CEO to the janitorial staff. I will, she whispered. And one more thing. I stepped closer. Never, ever tell another person to just knit and stay quiet. You have no idea what battles they've fought, what mountains they've climbed, or what power they might be holding in reserve. She was crying now, silent tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face. I'm sorry, she managed. I'm so sorry, Aunt Maggie. I looked at her for a long moment. This was my sister's daughter, a young woman who had been raised to believe that worth came from appearance, achievement, and the accumulation of status. She'd never learned that true power comes from how you treat people when you think no one important is watching. Apologies are a start, I said finally. But they're only words. Show me who you really are over the next 6 months. That's how you earn back my respect. I walked away, leaving her standing in the hallway. The flight back to Vermont was peaceful. I watched the clouds pass beneath the plane and thought about the strange journey that had brought me here, from a steel town in Ohio to the executive suite of a tech company, from the invisible sister to the majority shareholder. I hadn't planned any of this. I'd invested in NextGen because I believed in its mission, not because my niece worked there. The Thanksgiving confrontation had simply accelerated a reckoning that was probably inevitable. But I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel good. Not the revenge, I'm too old for pettiness. What felt good was finally being seen. Finally being acknowledged for what I'd accomplished. Finally standing in a room full of people who had underestimated me and watching them realize their mistake. 3 months have passed since that board meeting. Ashton has, to her credit, made genuine efforts to change. She started a mentorship program for junior employees. She apologized personally to several colleagues she'd apparently treated poorly over the years. She even called me last week, not to talk business, but to ask about my garden and my cats. I've been thinking about what you said, she told me. About not knowing what battles people have fought. I've been so focused on my own climb that I never stopped to consider anyone else's journey. That's a good realization, I said. Can I ask you something? Her voice was hesitant. Why didn't you ever tell anyone about your career? About your success? All those years at family dinners, and you just let us believe you were nobody. I thought about the question for a moment. Because I didn't need you to know, I said finally. My worth wasn't dependent on your approval. I knew who I was and what I'd accomplished. The only people who needed external validation were the ones who didn't have internal confidence. I paused. I hope you understand that someday. She was quiet for a long time. I'm starting to. Last week, I attended another family dinner at Patricia's house. This time, when the conversation turned to careers, something different happened. Ashton spoke up. Actually, before we go around the table, I think there's someone whose accomplishments we've overlooked for way too long. She looked at me. Aunt Maggie, would you tell everyone about your career? For real this time? Patricia looked confused. Janet set down her wine. The grandchildren stopped fidgeting. I smiled. Well, I said, it's a bit of a long story. For the next 45 minutes, I told them. About Wall Street in the 1980s. About the discrimination and the harassment and the triumphs. About managing billions of dollars while they thought I was just doing something with numbers. About retiring as one of the most successful female fund managers of my generation. About building a private equity portfolio that now included, among other things, majority ownership of my niece's company. When I finished, the table was silent. Patricia was crying. Maggie, I had no idea. Why didn't you ever tell us? You never asked, I said simply. And honestly, I didn't think you'd care. That hurt them, I could see it in their faces. But it was the truth. I care now, Patricia said, reaching for my hand. I'm so proud of you. And I'm so sorry we made you feel invisible. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. Decades of dismissal don't disappear over one dinner. But it was a start. As I drove back to Vermont the next morning, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The decades of loneliness. The glass ceilings I'd shattered while no one was watching. The quiet satisfaction of building an empire while everyone assumed I was irrelevant. I'm 68 years old. I have more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. I have a farmhouse full of cats and a garden full of tomatoes and yes, a basket full of half-finished knitting projects. I also have a seat on the board of a company that's changing healthcare. I have the respect of people who once dismissed me. And I have the knowledge that every gray hair on my head represents a battle I won when the odds were against me. My niece told me to knit and stay quiet. Instead, I showed up as her boss. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and comment below where you're watching from. I'd love to know how many people have been underestimated because of their age, their appearance, or their quiet demeanor. And remember, the most powerful people in the room aren't always the loudest. Sometimes, they're the ones sitting quietly in the corner, watching, listening, waiting. Never underestimate the old woman who knits. She might just own the company. This is Margaret Hollister. And this is my truth. Closing lines. The most powerful people in the room aren't always the loudest. Sometimes, they're the ones sitting quietly in the corner, watching, listening, waiting. Never underestimate the old woman who knits. She might just own the company.